So our final session of the day will be a fireside that'll go into war financing, taxation, expansion of the money supply, and how that leads to a decline of democracy. The professor of Cornell, who is going to be with us on this next session, is highly experienced and has gone into a book on this topic and has researched a lot of things about taxation and war. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Kreps, Director of the Tech Policy at Cornell University and the author of Taxing Wars. And to lead the discussion, Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation. Let's give a round of applause.
So we're going to spend the final session here thinking about the past and the future. I'm excited to have Sarah here with us. She's the author of this fabulous book, Taxing Wars, that really changed my mind about a lot of things, about the way the world works. It made me very curious about why we don't think harder about how governments raise money and how they spend money. And essentially, the provocative thesis behind taxing wars is that borrowing for war essentially can kill or damage democracy. And the book is terrific because it draws on hundreds of years of thought as well as a lot of data showing that over time, at least in democracies mostly, the way that wars have been funded have evolved from something where citizens have been very involved through whether it be a draft or direct taxation, where you would see on your taxes that they went up because of war, or bonds that were specifically war bonds, or they used to call them liberty bonds. So basically, war has transformed, at least in America and other countries, from something where citizens were very, very involved and at least very cognizant about what was happening, to today, modern war is just completely distant from people's lives. And that is essentially, in her book, Sarah shows how this can be very damaging to the idea of democracy. So I wanted to start by just asking her to tell us a little bit about her journey, how she became interested in this topic, walk us through some of the book, the thesis, the historical background. We're going to show you some charts that I think will be very provocative for you. And then at the end, we can talk about how this might change. I mean, what does the world look like if it's all of a sudden a lot harder to borrow for war? If the sort of foundation of the financial system is different? Or, I mean, even what would it look like if, for example, bonds were labeled as such? You know, maybe instead of just buying U.S. Treasury bonds, you've got healthcare bonds and war bonds and environment bonds, and that would be interesting. Like maybe that would be interesting. So we're going to dive into a few things to keep us thinking about the future. But first, we'll go to the past. Sarah, just tell us about your story and how you wound up with this amazing book.
Well, thank you, Alex. And I want to start first by thanking the organizers of Bitcoin Atlantis. This has been amazing. And I want to thank Alex for reaching out a few years ago and helping me kind of connect the dots between what I had written and alternatives to fiat like Bitcoin. So I'm really excited to be here at this conference because it kind of helps connect everything together. And so I appreciate how welcoming everyone has been. I come at this from the perspective of political science, and in particular, a subfield called international relations. And so several years ago, I was talking to a colleague from Latin America, and he was studying security taxes, war taxes in Colombia and in Costa Rica. And I said, well, what do those taxes do? And they were taxes that were paying specifically for the security situation in those countries. And I said, well, that's really interesting because we don't have those in the United States. And so I kind of went down a rabbit. Yes, anymore. Well, that was the thing. So I thought, well, I wonder if we ever had those. And it turns out we did. The U.S. used to have them. And the reason, there's so many reasons this is important. But fundamentally, the fact that the countries like the U.S., and it's not just the U.S., it's a lot of Western democracies, have moved away from this practice. So liberal theorists like Immanuel Kant centuries ago had tied the payment of taxes to something called the democratic peace theory. And so the argument essentially was that what makes democracies different and more peaceful is that the citizens paid in blood and treasure for the wars that were being fought. And once they had that skin in the game, they would be more reflective of the decisions that were being made abroad. So I had been working on the topic of drones, and I thought, well, we're not really paying for wars in blood anymore because the U.S. is using drones, and so there's that disconnect. And I looked at the way we were paying for wars, and there was a huge disconnect there. So some members of the U.S. Congress were trying to pitch war taxes, and every time that would get shot down. So
this was like in the context of the Iraq War, 2004, 5, 6. Some senators and congressmen in the United States were like, "Hey, we should raise money if you guys want to keep doing this war with taxes that people would have to pay for." And basically, this idea was seen as crazy. And they're like, "No, we're just going to borrow to do it, and that way the citizens, don't really know, and no one will get angry, and we can still fight the war." So that was actually pretty recent. I mean, that was happening 15 years ago.
Right, and then what happens in Congress is if you have good ideas, good policies, but they're unpopular, you have to no longer run for office, and that's exactly what happened to these guys.
Yeah, like John Murtha was a great example.
John Murtha, Charlie Rangel with conscription, right? So they were trying to advance this idea, and it just wasn't politically palatable.
The other interesting thing is that, from building on what you're saying, it kind of restrains a country in a way. It makes them a little more pacifist. Like you have to, and your book does a great job of reminding us of this. But it was very, 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 very hard to get the U.S. to enter World War II. Like we weren't going to go, even though this horrible thing was happening, and World War I, but especially World War II. I mean, we weren't going to go until we were bombed. I mean, it just wasn't going to happen until we were directly attacked. And public sentiment and public opinion in your book, you show this. People were just not interested, and therefore they weren't going to go because at that time they paid for the war, and it took this change of public sentiment for it to make it possible.
Right, because what paying the taxes does is really give you that skin in the game. You're doing more of the cost benefit. Here's what I'm paying. What do I think of the benefit of this particular action? And there are also cases when you go back all these years historically. So there was this episode in 1798. Seems like an obscure historical factoid, but maybe some people watched Alexander Hamilton, and he tried to generate funds for a possible conflict with France. Couldn't do it, so we couldn't go to war. And so it's not just that without paying, the wars go longer. It's you can't get into a war if you can't raise the funds.
And the book walks through how essentially World War I and World War II, at least, as the U.S. became essentially a modern state. Before then, it was a totally different ballgame, but these are wars that were paid for overwhelmingly with taxes and war bonds. I think in World War II, U.S. citizens bought what would be today $3 trillion of war bonds.
Right.
I think something like 70+ million people bought bonds. I mean, this was very democratic. People would do it all the time. And that connected them to the war. And this continued somewhat through the Korean War, but there's this moment during the Vietnam War where Lyndon B. Johnson wants to raise taxes for Vietnam, and it's part of his downfall. And we've never raised taxes for war ever since. Every single war we've fought since 1967 has been on the national credit card, which, in many people's opinion, and including mine, is very damaging for democracy. It leads to a situation where, ever since 9/11, we've borrowed for all of these forever wars, basically, and they all go on the national credit card. And the interest we pay on these wars is so immense, but it doesn't reflect immediately in people's lives. It's more quiet, right? So, for example, we've paid more than $1 trillion on interest alone for the forever wars in the first 20 years of them since 2001. And this decade, we're going to pay another $1 trillion. And then it gets steeper and steeper and steeper because one of the most expensive items is taking care of the 4 million veterans who fought in these wars. I mean, think about 4 million times anything is very expensive. Now think about how expensive their health care is and all the psychological services they need and all the help they need. Well, times 4 million, right? So that's an enormous burden on our state that's going to have to get paid over the next 20, 30 years. So the interest on this stuff is actually going to explode beyond $1 trillion a decade. And yet the average American is just clueless about this to the point where we enter wars now and the average person has no idea. No idea at all. Like Obama started this war called Operation Inherent Resolve that cost tens of billions of dollars. And I would bet you that 99 out of 100 Americans would have no idea what you're talking about. It was a war in 5 different countries. And most people just have no idea. So we've become completely disconnected from war making, which what the point you're making is that sort of destroys democratic peace theory. Because the whole point is that if we're a democracy, we have skin in the game and we're less likely to fight. But if you take that skin in the game away from us, we're no different from, an authoritarian regime that can just fight whenever it wants, in a way. And I thought that was very, very interesting.
Right, and the democratic aspect of that is transparency, is that there should be a deliberative process.
And consensus.
And consensus, right, And so a couple other historical points to add to that. So the Korean War was paid for through war taxes alone. And alone.
Yeah,
and,
think about that. It's wild.
Harry Truman did not get a second term because he was voted out as high tax Harry. So the political consequences of this, I think, have been made quite clear. Another thing I would just add, which adds some texture to this as well, I spent some time at the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. Really interesting because you can go through all these letters that President Roosevelt received during the war, and we think about this as a popular war. There was a lot of not just awareness, but antipathy toward these war taxes from librarians in Ohio and from the labor movement about these taxes. And the salient aspect of that is that people saw that they were being taxed. And so it was very much front of mind for a policymaker. Hey, I'm getting this hate mail about these taxes. I better make this kind of something that really matters.
I remember reading them because you have them in the book, examples of these letters, and you start to realize there was super widespread discontent about this. But another interesting thing I wanted to ask you was the U.S. dollar system changed pretty dramatically from 1900 to 2000, right? So you went from a system that was much more sort of tied to gold, not fully, but much more so. And then we had the creation of the Federal Reserve, and then we had essentially the sort of gold, the Genoa Conference, and we had the centralization of gold, and then we had Bretton Woods. So it wasn't the gold directly anymore. It was dollars promised to pay for gold, and then we eventually went off gold completely. And what's interesting is that the severing of gold from money in America happens at the same exact time when we start borrowing for war. So if you think about it, we start borrowing for war in the late 60s as a primary means to finance war. And that's right when Congress severs the final link between gold and dollars. Nixon severed the ability of foreign governments to redeem gold for dollars in 71, but it was in the late 60s that the Congress actually completely severed the internal domestic US dollar from gold. So when you untether the dollar from something physical and limited, all of a sudden we start borrowing massively for war. I just think this is super powerful. Have you ever thought about that, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's something that has emerged through our conversations, but it's something that connects to several of the panels that came before us about the global South and this privilege of countries like the United States to just kind of continue to borrow. I think back about the British sterling and when the pound was the reserve currency. So they were able to borrow heavily for the wars in the 1700s and 1800s because that was the world currency. And so it gives that powerful kind of world, the world's reserve currency, this privilege that I think also sets it up to overreach as well when it comes to foreign wars.
And when you look at the early 70s, once we had kind of severed the link internally between gold and dollars, the spending started to accelerate so much that now the foreign governments didn't trust us. They thought we would do what Britain did, which in 68, Britain defaulted on its gold promises. So they thought the US would do the same thing. So you literally had countries like France send warships to New York City in 1971 to try and get their gold back from the United States. and that led Nixon that summer to go on TV and do the Nixon shock speech where he said, we're no longer going to we're no longer going to redeem all these dollars for gold anymore. But I thought that's interesting because, what drove the pressure on that was war. I mean, really, yes, it was the Great Society, but mainly David Graeber in the book Debt argues that it's basically the Vietnam War is the reason we left the gold standard, because we had to pay for this war by borrowing, and we couldn't redeem it for gold anymore. We had to leave the physical connection between money and something physical to keep fighting. And what happened was the dollar collapsed, basically. Between 71 and 74, the dollar lost more than half its value against the German mark. I mean, it was really in free fall. We had super high inflation in the United States. There's other factors for that, but it was basically a moment in time where people had a lot of doubts about the dollar. And then that's when we came and we created this petrodollar system to try and address the issue and to try and get the oil countries to prop up the dollar. And then it worked extremely well. And that's the system we've had ever since. But you could kind of see where it was going unless it was able to be propped up by an external factor. So I thought that's interesting as well.
It's also, just more generally, when you start to look at the history of money, it's also the history of war. So many, in many cases, so many of the big innovations resulted in that context of war. And I think what has happened, in universities is that everyone is siloed, and so rarely do they connect these two things. So you have the economists, or historians, and then you have the political scientists, and no one actually integrates these things.
I mean, I did an essay on this a few years ago for Bitcoin Magazine about the Fed and QE, and I got interested because I was like, wait a second, would the forever wars have been possible without super low, artificially low interest rates? And my theory was no, and I kind of dug into it. And there's just so little in the realm of war finance. There's just not that many books about it. Like, it's just not that explored, which is really interesting. I'm sure you encountered the same thing.
I've actually gone back even further. So I have a paper, an article in the upcoming, or forthcoming, I should say, Satoshi Papers, which is really exciting. So
tell us about that.
Yeah, so it takes some of these ideas and goes back, and some of what you've written about, and goes back even further. So you look at the Roman Empire and the use of coinage, and then the way that, these wars are going on, and they're running out of money, so they start to debase the currency.
Always,
yeah. Right.
Well, so the Vietnam War, we ran out of money, so we had to debase the currency, and that's exactly what happened. So let's go through some of the numbers and charts.
Yeah, sure.
Tell us what's happening here.
It's going to be a little hard to read. What I want to
why don't you let's just stand up and allow people to look.
Attention to here. The key part is, so this is the U.S. context, and it's the focus on the U.S. because the U.S. has tended to fight a lot of big wars globally, so there's a lot of data. And so early on, there was a tendency to what I called the Liberty Bond Wars. So this is where there's consent-based, it's transparent. We're going to go fight a war, and we need to generate revenue. So you go to the people to do it. That's more the democratic peace idea. But then what Alex was talking about in recent years, all these recent wars are what I call hide-and-seek wars. So this is the U.S. saying, we're going to just kind of go abroad. We're not going to go to the public. We're not going to have these debates. Like Johnson said, I don't want to have a war tax because that means we're going to have a debate about.
Right. And look, when it permanently goes to hide and seek war, it's right as the dollar's leaving. It's right as the dollar's leaving the
Yes.
gold standard and turning into the fiat standard.
That is exactly right. Right. So then we've had these hide and seek wars ever since, and my argument is that this is the unraveling of accountability.
And then what do we have here?
So we have the U.S. tax to GDP ratio. This is basically this is the amount of money that the government has generated from the public over time. And this is where I was talking earlier about the relationship between money and war. So every time there was a blip, this corresponds to a U.S. war. So the War of 1812, the Civil War, First World War, Second World War. What you see after the Second World War...
We go into a permanent warfare state.
Then we go to permanent, exactly. We just stay high and keep collecting.
So to reiterate, these bumps here are all wars, and then we would return to a different type of economic activity.
Yeah.
And then we've just never left the warfare state since essentially since fiat money was sort of created.
Exactly.
So
and then over here is our debt. Right, and so this is also what we've been talking about, which is that, this sort of was variable, and now it's just permanently high. Yeah,
and then we have spending on defense and entitlements as a percentage of the federal budget.
Yeah, so this is a little bit adjacent, but the point here is that we talk about the warfare state actually as a percentage of GDP that has and spending has gone down. But these are the areas, too, that end up... So my argument from the book is that in the U.S. context, and I see this actually in a European context as well, is that no one wants to make hard choices at all.
Right.
And so you keep spending. It's not a gun... Here it looks like a guns butter trade-off, but it's hard in the U.S. context to think there's any trading off going on when you're spending $800 billion on defense every year. There's just a lot of spending.
Right, meaning that the total amount is staying pretty static.
Right,
despite
exactly.
Whether we're in war or not. And even in the 80s, it built up quite a bit. And then we have the wars without end.
Yeah, this is kind of the central argument, which is there is a bit correlation, but what we know is that all of these wars that were hide-and-seek wars have been the longest wars that have been fought, whereas the ones where it was tied to this kind of consent mechanism were more accountable.
Yeah, whether it was tied to the citizens being forced to be involved, or whether it was tied to gold in a way, where the government just found it kind of harder to borrow. These wars lasted, only a few years.
That's right.
And then the top three, are just insane, and they were all paid for by borrowing and by debasement. So, I guess the question is what happens in a world where it's harder to borrow for war. One thing that I looked at when I was doing my research was, in America at least, and I'll just talk about my own country, but if you look at how things are funded in the United States, taxes, which of course would exist in any kind of economic system, the government's going to tax if the base currency is Bitcoin or dollars or whatever. The federal government's going to have a bunch of tax revenue. And today, a lot of that is steered towards social welfare programs that people want in a democratic society. People want to help healthcare and education and things like that. They don't necessarily pay for war. Again, war is usually paid for by borrowing, which is not done through consensus. So the question is, well, in a world where it's harder to borrow, well, maybe war takes a back seat because people are going to prioritize things that matter to them the most in their communities and societies, which tend to quite evidently be welfare. I don't know if this is something you've thought about, or what are your thoughts around what happens if we become a little more constrained in terms of the ability to borrow, and what happens if the people are brought back more into the public discussion about war?
You're right, and so certainly politically we're not bringing back conscription, we're not bringing in war taxes, and so the question then is what other mechanisms of accountability might there be? Mm-hmm. And I think this is where our work overlaps really nicely, and Alex wrote this piece on the Bitcoin peace theory, no pun intended, the Bitcoin
Bitcoin peace theory,
PEACE. And you should talk about what the argument was, but it really kind of integrated our sets of insights, which is if you had a reserve currency that was finite rather than infinite in our ability to borrow, that you might have
Yeah,
more
the
accountability.
basic idea is that, as we've discussed, democratic peace theory is this idea that democracies are less likely to fight and at least start wars because the people are involved. Whereas in a dictatorship, the government can do whatever it wants. The people have no say. And that fiat money has essentially really reduced the effectiveness of democratic peace theory because the government can just borrow for war very easily without being, involved with the people. So the Bitcoin peace theory idea is that Bitcoin peace theory kind of fixes democratic peace theory, or rather Bitcoin fixes democratic peace theory because it brings back the skin in the game element, and it actually might help with democracy. And I see a lot of people around the world criticizing Bitcoin, and they think it's going to be dangerous for the state, and it's going to undermine the government. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I think this is going to fix the government. I think this is going to help us reduce all of these exploitative things we do abroad and help us refocus on what we should do at home. And it's going to help essentially bring what I think would be a more peaceful world. And this is why when Jack tweeted a few years ago, Bitcoin is going to bring world peace, I think a lot of people were like, oh my God, he's crazy. But no, you have to actually think about what those words mean. And there really is something to it that's quite significant that needs to be unpacked in this way, right?
Right, and I think his tweet took a step in that direction. Your article in Bitcoin Magazine took a step in that direction. And what I'm trying to do in this Satoshi paper is unpack that a little bit more. Like,
So when is that coming out?
As soon as I get my edits back. No, I think.
And how can people find it? Where will people find it?
So it's the Texas Bitcoin
Council.
Council.
So they have a
Natalie's
series of
group.
papers.
Yeah.
Tour is doing this, right?
Yeah.
Tour and Natalie.
Yeah, exactly,
they're involved.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all in this kind of
It's going to be great.
I think it's going to be great.
So look out for this paper later this year, for sure.
Yeah.
And you're also now doing work with BPI. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, BPI is great. I've been talking about it throughout this weekend. So the Bitcoin Policy Institute, so it's DC-based think tank, and usually think tank is kind of a dirty word.
Yeah.
Like think
No,
versus,
it's a great think tank.
versus do. I think it's a very much a doer kind of tank, or whatever the equivalent would be. But what we're trying to do, and with the leadership of David Zell and for those who know him, and Grant McCarty, that kind of help with the education process. There's so much sort of visceral skepticism of Bitcoin in Washington, which is why it's Washington-based, and try to connect with policymakers about some of the concerns about Bitcoin. So there's an upcoming Bitcoin policy summit.
They have a summit in D.C. in April that most of you should check out. It's a fabulous organization. Go support BPI. And then, maybe it would be interesting. I thought it was interesting in your book. You're not just some distant analyst. Like, you've had experience inside the military industry. So maybe you could just share that, because I think that's useful for people to understand.
Yeah, it is true, Alex. I wasn't sure whether to bring that up earlier, but I think it is relevant that I was in the military. And that was
very relevant.
Well, it's also relevant to, that was one of the reasons I got into drones, is because I was involved with that quite some time ago. But I also worked in the Pentagon, so I was involved in the budgeting process. And it was such an eye-opening experience.
I can only imagine. The world's largest building probably holds a lot of secrets, huh? And a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of craziness.
It's a lot of craziness. It was, when I was 22, I had a budget of $1 billion, which used to be a lot of money. That doesn't sound like a lot anymore, but
no, that was a lot of in today's
22,
dollars. Yeah.
And so that, I think, opened my eyes to, I was based in Washington in the Pentagon and working with these different agencies and seeing how decisions are made and the constraints or lack of constraints and accountability in this process. Yeah, go ahead.
And was there like a personal moment or reason why you decided to publish this book? Like, what was the you could have done like a small paper. Like, what drove you to make a book?
Good question, Alex. I needed to get promoted at Cornell. And no, but I was it seemed like it was an ambitious enough question that it lent itself to a book. But, the evolution really, the intellectual journey was very much coming from the study of drones and seeing these very much as these, sort of the money side and the kind of cost and blood with drones as two sides of the same coin, really. Is they're both part of accountability. And it's not to say that I want to, see more casualties on the battlefield, but it's the absence of that leads to this sort of apathy in the process.
Well, one other thing we didn't mention is that the opacity of funding through the Pentagon and the defense budget has become incredible in recent decades. Like it's actually, and I think some of this is in your book and some of it's in other research, but the amount of congressional inquiries into like how wars work have dropped off a cliff. Like in the 60s and 70s, there were tons of inquiries and transparency into war making.
That's true.
And it's staggering. The data I found was outrageous. I mean, we're talking about a Congress that was very interested in questioning war in the 60s, and today there's almost no questioning at all. And a lot of them are obviously, there's corruption, and there's honestly there's people who are tied to the industry, and there's lobbying, and that's advanced a lot. If you think about Eisenhower's speech and what he warned against, it's happened. But I just found that staggering that there's just basically almost a total lack of interest among our elected representatives in asking tough questions about war finance, whereas they used to be really, really aggressive about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, a couple things on that. So there's this whole line in the budget called Overseas Contingency Operations. Washington speak calls it OCO. And it's called OCO because no one actually knows, no one knows what's in it. No one's allowed to question what's in it. This is just all overseas contingency operations.
And this is like a lot of money.
And it's something like, again, not as big as it's like $60 billion a year.
Okay, it's a lot of money.
I think it's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
So this will go to fight. Yeah, this will go to pay for everything from Libya to any of these. There were several members of the U.S. military killed in Jordan a couple months ago.
Right.
And the reaction is, oh, we have people in Jordan.
Yeah.
Like
most
no one
Americans
knows
had no idea.
that.
Yeah.
Because there's no accountability. As we've been talking about this, sort of the evolution and the genesis of this, I worked in a building that was built in the 90s, and it was $300 million. Again, not a ton of money, but it was this reconnaissance office.
Yeah.
And it was just the black budget.
Wow.
And you couldn't, and Congress did not know about it at all. And so I got into this program and then was involved in the overhead satellite program that spent $8 to $9 billion and then was canceled, and started really thinking about kind of money and budgets and transparency or lack thereof. And I will say that these industries have been very smart about it because they make sure that they have offices throughout the country so that it gives these members of Congress a lot of skin in the game to not cancel these programs.
Well, that's another thing that might change. Well, look, in general, thank you for sharing these insights. I mean, I think a lot of times we might see something that looks ridiculous, and you're like, oh, Bitcoin is gonna, help reduce war or whatever, and that might seem insane. But you actually have to think deeply about it, and you have to understand that per all the data we've showed you, it's pretty hard to argue that the shift towards easier money has not led to more wars. Like, I mean, it's definitely led to wars that the people of democracies are not as involved in, that last a lot longer, and that are really hard to push back against. So a shift in the money, really, really clearly could change war making in a dramatic way, and that's just something I think that we can maybe leave here, maybe a little hopeful about, as Bitcoin continues on its journey of becoming a larger and larger force in the global economic system. Maybe one day it becomes big enough to actually bring about peace, which we so desperately need. So anyway, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Everybody should go check out Taxing Wars and pay attention to her new paper and work with BPI. Thanks, everybody. Let's give a big round of applause to Sarah. And that concludes the freedom and human rights portion. I really appreciate that you all stuck around. HRF appreciates it. We'll see you guys later. Thank you, Bitcoin Atlantis.